What most children in the United States learn in elementary school is that in 1620 the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic from England, landing at Plymouth Rock, where it disgorged 100-odd pilgrims on the beach of what would one day become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They found an empty wilderness completely devoid of... Oh, hey, who's that over there? The man named Tisquantum, now mostly remembered in English as Squanto, had in fact been to England, traveling with John Smith of all people, and had learned the language. When he returned to New England, it was to find his home village destroyed by disease, likely the same illnesses brought by the Spanish to the New World over a century prior. But instead of being able to grieve, he instead found a bunch of white people squatting on his ancestral homeland, stealing the possessions of his dead loved ones, and even looting their graves. Despite all of this, Tisquantum decided to be the bigger man, and taught the pilgrims how to fish and how to grow New World crops like corn, squash, and beans. Because of him, they were able to survive, and because of him, the United States exists as we know it today. And according to legend, the pilgrims thanked Squanto and the Wampanoag tribe that had adopted him by holding a massive feast, which in the United States we celebrate every year as Thanksgiving. Never mind that within a decade, the tenuous peace between the two groups collapsed as ever more white settlers landed on the shores of Massachusetts, leading to tensions and eventually war. Because here we must confront the cognitive dissonance of American public education. There is one idea of the American continent being a vast wilderness, empty and unpopulated, needing to be civilized by the European settlers. This is often called manifest destiny. On the other hand, we have all those nasty, savage Indians needing to be eradicated unless they happen to be nice Indians, and then we can trade with them for a bit before shoving them onto a reservation 100 miles from their native lands. Even when white folk are sympathetic to Native Americans, it's often with this idea of the noble savage, of being quote-unquote primitive, yet somehow that's a good thing. We'll explore more when I eventually get to Pocahontas. This is completely disregarding the fact that Indigenous Americans had cities with populations rivaling those of any in Europe. They had extensive agriculture, and they worked stones and metals as needed for tools and jewelry. So where does this idea of America being empty come from? If you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel, or watched the CGP Grey video about plagues, then you know where this is headed. When Europeans came to the New World, they brought with them many diseases, most notably flu and smallpox, that Native Americans had never experienced before, and thus had no natural immunity to. There is some evidence that some of the colonizers were aware of this and deliberately infected natives. In any case, due mostly to disease, in the 100 years following Columbus's first interactions with the Taino in the Caribbean, 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died. When English settlers came to what would become the United States, they often found the homes and farms of those now dead Native Americans, like the Pilgrims did. Before the novel pandemics, those indigenous peoples would have kept roads between villages clear of undergrowth, tended farms, and built structures. To the white settlers, the land would thus seem both empty yet tamed. It is also worth noting that Native American farming practices often differed from European ones, such as with the Three Sisters, planting corn, squash, and beans together on the same plots. This was done deliberately, maximizing the yields from the three different crops, but to a European settler used to monoculture crops in neat planted rows, it would have looked no different from wild weeds intermingling. It should also be stressed how much religion and eventually racism played a role in the dynamic between Europeans and Native Americans. To the white Christians, the indigenous Americans would have been seen as pagans who had never known the gospel, never been visited by Jesus. Those white Christians would have seen it as their God-given duty to evangelize to those supposed heathens, and failing that, kill them for defying the one true religion. With the advent of the transatlantic slave trade and the rise of race based on skin color as an idea, it shifted from being about converting heathens to about eliminating the red savages. This didn't just include literal killing, but also cultural genocide. Children were stolen from Native American families and raised in so-called Indian schools to indoctrinate them into Euro-American culture. Kill the Indian, save the man. This kept happening well into the 20th century, by the way, and the federal government still operates a few schools inside Indian reservations. It was only this year, discovered just a couple weeks before I recorded this video that a sitting US president actually apologized for the federal government's role in this atrocity. By the mid-1800s, most Native Americans on the eastern seaboard had been killed, forcibly removed, or isolated on minuscule reservations. Most white or black Americans would have never even seen an Indigenous American outside of a book or the occasional circus. They would have seemed like a distant memory, fertile fodder for writing tragic fantasy stories about, such as The Last of the Mohicans. It is at this time that westward expansion begins. Go west, tame the wild frontier. Go west, kill the savage Indian. Go west, the land is empty and must be farmed. Go west, the land is full of Indians that need to be killed. Lewis and Clark made it to the Pacific. Oh, and I guess Sacagawea helped. I mean, her people had already been there like loads of times anyway. It doesn't really count. What really matters is the first time white people do things. Books and films about the colonization of the Americas, even up to the current day, resonate inside the poles of this cognitive dissonance. The presence and accomplishments of Indigenous Americans are erased, and when they are allowed to be acknowledged, it is either as evil redskins for our milk-white protagonists to defeat, or as magical Indians who exist only to help our noble Caucasian heroes. Indigenous Americans are othered in their own homeland, their very agency stolen, just like so many other things. Disney is not immune to this. You may have expected me to cover this topic with Peter Pan or Pocahontas, not this random package era film, but there is a surprising amount of Indigenous erasure in Melody Time, so let's dig in. In the late 40s, the Disney studio was still recovering from being used to churn out propaganda during World War II. I have already covered this ground several times in other videos, yada yada. Melody Time is essentially Make Mine music to The Legend of Curly's Gold. This go around, there are only 7 segments. Let's start with the ones that have the least to do with today's theme. Once Upon a Winterland is about 4 breeding pairs: humans, rabbits, squirrels, and horses.
A couple of rodents looking for a theme park.
The humans and rabbits mirror one another with the usual men and women don't understand each other nonsense. It's slightly refreshing that it turns out both men and women are useless, whether human or bunny, and it falls to the squirrels and the horses to rescue the others from the inevitable waterfall that always seems to show up in these sorts of things. The animation is in a very pleasing Mary Blair style, but this segment is eminently forgettable. Speaking of forgettable, Bumble Boogie. I wish I could say this jazzy reimagining of the Rimsky-Korsakov finger twister was created specifically for this film, but no, it debuted 2 years earlier in It's Great to Be Young. Man, what is it with old movies and vague titles? There's a black and white film from 1951 about a dog and a horse who die and go to heaven, but then are reincarnated as human beings to solve the dog's murder. And what did they call it? You Never Can Tell. How does that title tell me anything about the movie? Anyway, this short drags the original piano piece on for about twice its usual length and is very repetitive. It's novel for maybe 30 seconds. Little Toot is a reskin of Pedro the Plane, made a little longer and marginally more interesting. At least Pedro never accidentally committed boat 9/11. Very few of us can say that as children we inadvertently doomed thousands of innocents, so maybe you can let yourself let go of your imposter syndrome, Angela. It's time. None of us know what we're doing. We're all imposters. It's okay. At any rate, this short is banal and tedious, though I will admit the Andrews sisters sure know how to make an earworm.
Can't you hear that cheering crowd? You have made your daddy proud. You are now a big toot, little toot.
Then we get Trees, based on the lightweight poem by Joyce Kilmer. God, I love trees! Aren't trees pretty? Trees! The Disney artists and the choir they hired tried their damnedest to make this seem dramatic, but it just isn't.
But only God can make
As I was finishing up the script for the previous review and was looking ahead to this one, I was struggling to pick a thesis statement. I had at first been considering something along the lines of, is it okay to just put in the barest amount of effort and pass it off as fine? These 4 segments aren't offensive or even annoying, but neither are they memorable or profound in any way. They're safe creations of a machine of mass production. Sometimes that's fine. We all get McDonald's when we're in a hurry or on the road. There's a place for things that are sort of average. Not everything has to be a Rembrandt. But when you hear the name Disney, you expect more than that. If I were forced to pick between watching Fun and Fancy Free and watching Melody Time, I'm probably gonna pick Melody Time, but that doesn't mean I'm going to seek out Melody Time on its own merits. Like, what does Bumble Boogie have to say? What does Little Toot teach our children? Kid, make sure you never make a mistake, because if you do, thousands of people will die and you will be exiled for life.
Run away and never return.
And I thought Catholic guilt was bad. With Blame It on the Samba, we begin to approach my theme for this video. You know how in Make My Music I talked about how jazz, despite being created by African Americans, often gets whitewashed? Like how Bumble Boogie in this very movie was written and performed by a white guy? The exact same thing can be said about samba, which originated in the Afro-Brazilian community. I love Ethel Smith. She's a lot of fun. But this segment feels weirdly detached. Donald, Jose, and the Araquan bird all return, but without their voice actors. The Araquan is given new noises, sounding more like the flamingos from Alice in Wonderland. As a reminder, this is what he's supposed to sound like. There were commenters on my The Three Caballeros video who pointed out that the Bahia segment was also whitewashed. Less than half of Brazil's population identifies as fully white, but those are the only people we see in Disney's version of Salvador. And when Disney decided to do a segment based on the samba for Melody Time rather than getting a Brazilian musician, they got a white lady! Again, Ethel Smith is great, but it's still Erasure. Blame It on the Samba is nevertheless higher energy and more memorable than any of the other segments discussed so far, but I have to put that asterisk on it. It is while I was watching the Johnny Appleseed segment that I realized what I wanted to talk about for this video. This is probably the most well-remembered part of this film, often presented as its own short, and for good reason. It has lively music.
The Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord.
The best animation in this entire picture, and is the only part of this movie with anything of substance to say. You don't need to be strong or full of machismo to be worthy or to dare to leave your hometown. The world needs farmers and thinkers too, and that's a noble sentiment to espouse, if only it weren't in the particular context of the Western expansion of the United States. The West is portrayed in this segment as a vast, empty wilderness, devoid of any settlements or people before the settlers head out in their covered wagons. Native Americans show up exactly once here, at a hoedown where their animation is directly copied from the dance scene in The Martins and the Coys. They say nothing and add nothing. They are simply there as part of the background, with absolutely no nod given to the historical reality of tension between American Indians and westward American settlers. And that kind of hurt me to realize. I fondly remembered this segment the same way I did Casey at the Bat and Peter and the Wolf, but on a rewatch I can only realize that it peddles an ahistorical lie. The West wasn't empty. American settlers weren't claiming a wilderness. There were people living there already.
Nigger, you can't claim us. We live here. 500 million of us. Do you have a flag?
The historical human being who inspired this short, John Chapman, really did go around planting apple seeds everywhere. But why did he need to plant apple trees in the first place? Well, because apples aren't native to the Americas! There are native crab apples here, but the seeds Chapman planted originated in the Old World. All those foreign apple trees displaced native species. Almost every single fruit you find in a grocery store in the United States comes originally from Europe, Asia, or Africa. Pears, peaches, plums, cherries, mangoes, bananas, none of them are native to the Americas. There is a single notable fruit-bearing tree that is native to North America, the pawpaw. It specifically evolved to grow on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and since it's growing in its native environment, it doesn't need pesticides and is very hardy, dealing with a wide range in temperatures that other fruit trees can't. Apparently it was even George Washington's favorite dessert, and I have never seen one, let alone eaten one, in my entire life, despite having lived my entire life in the eastern United States. Why is that? The answer usually given is that, well, it doesn't ship well, it ripens quickly and starts to ferment quickly. But you can freeze it, you can can it or make jelly out of it, you can dehydrate it or bake it into pastries or even make liquor out of it. All the things you hear Johnny's guardian angel sing about apples in the movie.
Apple pickles, oh so tasty, apple tarts and apple pasty, apple dumplings, not to mention apple sass. Yes!
You can even make rope out of its bark, and yet here we are with apples having become so synonymous with American culture that we have the phrase American as apple pie. Thank you for that, John Chapman. But if I'm being honest, I'm only partially being sarcastic with that thanks. I fucking love apples. I literally eat an apple every day with lunch, and it's really thanks to Chapman that we have such a diversity of varieties. When you plant an apple from seed, you're essentially gambling with genetics. Most of the time, you're going to get an inedible sour crab apple that's only fit for cider. And for Western settlers in the 1800s, cider is honestly what they wanted. But every so often, you get a tasty sweet apple. Most modern apple growing is done via grafting. You take a branch from a tree you know makes good apples and you shove it into the trunk of another tree. That branch will keep making the same apples its old tree did. But growing new trees like that isn't far off from cloning, and when you have a lot of specimens with the exact same genetic makeup while you get a dependably consistent crop, that makes it more susceptible to disease. Have you ever wondered why banana candy doesn't taste like bananas? That's because bananas used to taste like that. It's just that that sweeter cultivar, Gros Michel, was almost entirely killed off by a fungal disease. The modern cultivar, called the Cavendish, was not as susceptible to that disease and is thus the one you find in your grocery store today. So while sticking to what you know tastes good can seem like a good idea, variety is usually better. And that's what Chapman's indiscriminate planting did, give us lots of new varieties of apple. Unfortunately, most of the original trees he planted were cut down by federal agents during Prohibition. Still, as great as apples are, it bears remembering what they replaced, what we lost, what has been erased. Regardless, the segment is still well made. I'll admit I get "the Lord is good to me" stuck in my head from time to time, which is weird since, as I've said previously, I'm no longer religious. That was another oddity in coming back to this short, realizing how immersed in Christian culture and missionary work it is. But again, we'll save that discussion for Hunchback. Johnny himself is probably the likeliest candidate for an eventual Lorcana card, but for my money, I want this skunk to get it. He's got riz, look at him, he's great. The final segment of this film is Pecos Bill, one of the large catalog of American tall tales. Where European fairy tales existed mainly to impart lessons to children, see my Bambi video for more detail, American tall tales are instead examples of folk etiology. An etiology is a story used to explain why something exists. The story of Adam and Eve is an etiology for why evil exists in the world, as is the myth of Pandora's box. Funny how that tends to get blamed on women. Perhaps the most famous tall tale, Paul Bunyan, is used to explain why there are so many lakes in Minnesota and how the Grand Canyon came to be. At the beginning of Disney's retelling of Pecos Bill, they mention Paul Bunyan as well as John Henry as other American heroes. However, I must point out that John Henry is rather unique among tall tales, not just for having a black protagonist, but in being less an etiology and more a cautionary tale of human skill versus industrialization. I'm sure that's totally not applicable in our day and age at all.
You could see a carpenter making a beautiful chair, and then one of your robots comes in and makes a better chair twice as fast. And then you superimpose on the screen, USR, shitting on the little guy.
That story actually has something to say, a point to get across, and a tragic ending as Henry dies hammering in the final rail spike. But do we have any of that with Pecos Bill? Let's see here. We've got explain how the Rio Grande was made. Okay. Explain why the painted desert is so colorful. Sure, sure. And explain why coyotes howl at the moon.
Who wrote this?
Pecos Bill isn't even an authentic tall tale. While Bunyan and Henry each originated organically from the oral traditions of lumberjacks and rail workers respectively, Pecos Bill was made up in the 20th century by Edward S. O'Reilly, who tried to pass it off as a real tall tale, and it seems Disney fell for that hook, line, and sinker. The segment begins with some live action, for some reason. Hello again, Luana Patton and Bobby Driscoll. Oh, we'll have a lot to say about you when we get to Peter Pan, don't you wait. Roy Rogers and his cowboy choir, and natter on for a while before the animation finally begins. After accidentally falling off the back of a wagon as a baby, Pecos Bill is raised by coyotes, and we see him interacting with a variety of desert animals. And I gotta say, Baby Bill's insane scream is my favorite thing in this entire movie. He then finds his horse, Widowmaker, and we see him carve out the Rio Grande. We can check that off the checklist. Do we get to see how he paints the painted desert?
While a tribe of painted Indians did a war dance, Pecos started shooting up their little game. He gave them redskins such a shake-up that they jumped out from their makeup. That's the way the painted desert got its name.
Wow. Yeah, let's get back to the theme of this video. What the fuck? Throughout this whole segment, the southwest of the modern US is depicted as empty and barren, just like the Midwest was oops all trees in the Johnny Appleseed segment. Native Americans show up exactly once for that awful racist quote-unquote joke, and as I've already discussed, that's just patently ahistorical. The Southwest was full of Native Americans. You got Navajo and Pueblo and Apache and Choctaw and Wallapai and Ute and Mojave and Caddo and Miwok and Hopi and Maricopa and Havasupai and Udam and Shoshone. The names Arizona and Mexico and Texas and Oklahoma and Utah all have Native American origins. In the 1800s, the southern United States was so full of Native Americans that Andrew Jackson rounded up tens of thousands of them and forced them westward, only for later American settlers to kill them or force them onto reservations. The history of the United States is one of blood and broken treaties. So pardon me if I'm not particularly entertained by Slewfoot Sue's bustle making her bounce to the moon and Pecos fucking Bill getting all sad because his horse got jealous. Coyotes don't howl at the moon because some white feral child with a gun fetish was mopey over his girlfriend. Coyote is a Native American word, because of course it fucking is! Coyotes figure heavily in many American Indian mythologies, often as a trickster and often in etiologies. In Navajo tradition, Coyote created the Milky Way and the phases of the moon. There are countless stories from indigenous American cultures with evocative imagery and profound messages to impart, and instead of seeing any of them, I have to watch Pecos fucking Bill. Disney is an American company, and thus its output tends to focus on Americans and America, but this equally applies to other indigenous groups. Films and books about Australia almost never involve Aboriginal Australians. At best, they slap some indigenous concepts like going walkabout, divorced from their original context, onto a story centered on white people. There are far too many books and movies about white idiots going to India or Thailand or Africa to find themselves, while the actual people who live there are just background noise for their personal spiritual journeys. It's just that American stories tend to be particularly bad about this sort of thing. Native Americans are almost never present, but sometimes tokens from their cultures are, like dream catchers or feather headdresses or wampum beads, purely for aesthetic or a misguided appropriation of a cultural concept without any regard for its actual meaning. This house was built on an Indian burial ground. Of course it was, Linda. This entire fucking country is an Indian burial ground. That's what genocide means. At the end of the day, Melody Time is one of Disney's more forgettable outings. The Johnny Appleseed segment is probably the only part actually worth seeking out on its own merits, though you should keep in mind the ahistoricity I've already mentioned. If you liked this video, I highly encourage you to check out my Patreon. Donating helps me acquire research materials and also lets me get videos out sooner. It's only $5 a month, or $10 if you'd like me to put your name at the end of my videos. It would go right here. Either way, join me next time as we take a look at the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad.